Greetings and welcome to Bigotry, No Sanction, a personal and communal journey, another MDHA educational video. I'm David Gruber. Who am I? Why am I here? Now, if you're a vice presidential history buff, you will immediately recognize those words and the way I just said them. This is how Admiral James Stockdale opened his remarks at the 1992 vice presidential debate, and it is one of the most misunderstood moments in modern political history. Of the three men on the stage, Stockdale had the most impressive resume, most of it in service and unimaginable sacrifice for his country. However, he had struggled to define himself as a political actor. That is what he was trying to address. It just came off looking really bad on TV, as you can see if you click on the link in the title. In the context of this presentation, I like opening with Admiral Stockdale's words, because unlike other presentations, in this one, it does matter who I am, and that helps explain why I am here. So basically, I have a split professional personality. I am an 8th generation rabbi, US born and Israeli bred. I have served in leadership positions in Israel, New Zealand, and 3 different American Jewish communities. I was once Orthodox, but now I define myself as a secular Jew. And today I spend most of my time as the Development and Communications Director of the Metro Dallas Homeless Alliance, or MDHA. And it is my role to strengthen MDHA as the backbone organization of Dallas's homeless response system, as well as the system itself, through fundraising, messaging, and relationship building. I like to quip that I don't do any of the real work around here. That is done by my colleagues. I just tell you about it and demand that you pay for it. And in this presentation, I draw on my role today as well as my background, because as my dad says, you can take the rabbi out of the synagogue, but you can't take the synagogue out of the rabbi. With that, let's begin. This is the Hebrew prophet Jeremiah. He, still in Judah, is asked an important question by his brethren who are in Babylon in the 6th century BCE. What are the people to do now that they have been exiled from their land? Should they plan on quickly returning to Judah or put down roots in Babylon? And in his answer, in chapter 29, he addresses this, but goes beyond this question. The people are not only to put down roots, but to seek the peace of Babylon, be good and loyal citizens, and even pray to the God of Judah for it. Now, though Jeremiah is speaking to the exiles of his time in the waning days of the First Temple period, the ancient rabbis built on this tradition. In the waning days of the Second Temple period, in the 1st century CE, Rabbi Hanina, the assistant high priest, tells the people, "Pray for the welfare of the kingdom, for without fear of it, people would swallow each other alive." Think about this for a second. The government he speaks of is the Roman Empire. This is the same Roman Empire that conquered Judea, put an end to its independence, and eventually, as depicted in this work of art, destroyed its great temple. Still, pray for its welfare, for without the order it imposes, society falls apart. And so, through the generations, Jews kept praying for their rulers and the welfare of their governments. The Jews carried this tradition with them wherever they went, including to the Americas. And in 1790, the new president of the United States, George Washington, traveled through the states to sell the new Constitution. And one of his stops was to be Newport, Rhode Island. The Jews of Newport abided by their traditions and prayed for the US government. However, they dared to think one step further. Perhaps this new democratic experiment could yield something better. Perhaps this new country would reciprocate and treat them as equals. This was almost unheard of in Europe, where Jews were barely tolerated and certainly never thought of as equals of their Christian brethren. And so the Jews of Newport wrote a letter to their new national leader, hoping beyond hope that this country would be different. Washington wrote a letter back, copying many of the phrases the Jews of Newport had used into his own letter. And the letter signed simply G. Washington is still read in full at an annual ceremony at the Touro Synagogue in Newport. The citizens of the United States of America have a right to applaud themselves for giving to mankind examples of an enlarged and liberal policy, a policy worthy of imitation. All possess alike liberty of conscience and immunities of citizenship. It is now no more that toleration is spoken of, as if it was by the indulgence of one class of people that another enjoyed the exercise of their inherent natural rights. For happily the government of the United States, which gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance, requires only that they who live under its protection should demean themselves as good citizens. May the children of the stock of Abraham who dwell in this land continue to merit and enjoy the goodwill of the other inhabitants, while everyone shall sit under his own vine and fig tree, and there shall be none to make him afraid. May the Father of all mercies scatter light and not darkness in our paths, and make us all in our several vocations useful here, and in his own due time and way everlastingly happy. Now, the United States at the time would stand out in this sense. In later years, with the coming of the Napoleonic Wars and with the Enlightenment sweeping across Western Europe, other countries adopted policies under which Jews enjoyed rights approaching the full equal rights enjoyed by Jews in the United States. However, in Eastern Europe, home to the ancestors of most of today's American Jews, this was still a foreign concept well into the 20th century. The government and its rulers, whom the Jews still would pray for, at most tolerated the Jews and at worst persecuted them. That was just part of life. The humorous representation of this is preserved in the opening scene of Fiddler on the Roof, when the village rabbi is asked what blessing one must recite upon seeing the Tsar. The rabbi pauses for a moment and says, "May God bless and keep the Tsar far away from us." And you can click on the word persecution and watch this short video for yourself. When Eastern European Jews like the ones represented in Fiddler would arrive in the United States, they could not even comprehend that any government would treat them any differently. Between 1907 and 1914, small groups of Eastern European Jewish immigrants were brought to Galveston rather than going through Ellis Island. In one instance, a group was greeted not only by fellow Texas Jews, but by Galveston's mayor, Henry Landis, who welcomed them to the community. They were stunned. Historian Bernard Marenbach, in his book Galveston, Ellis Island of the West, quotes a representative of the newly arrived Jews, who spoke for all of them in response to the mayor's warm welcome. "We are overwhelmed that the ruler of the city should greet us. We have never been spoken to by the officials of our country except in terms of harshness. And although we have heard of the land of great freedom, it is very hard to realize that we are permitted to grasp the hand of the great man. We will do all we can to make good citizens." Now, these ideas and the approach of the United States to the Jews had legal ramifications in Jewish law. We find this in the writings of Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, a native of Eastern Europe and the premier scholar of Jewish law in the mid-20th century. He warns school administrators not to attempt to receive more government support than they are entitled to. Why? Because the United States is different. It is a kingdom of kindness. Hebrew lacks a word for a representative form of government, whose only goal is to do good on behalf of the residents of the country. This is definitely not what the fiddler's fictional rabbi would ever dream of saying about the Tsar. Now, one could triumphantly and optimistically end this discussion here, and that would be a lovely story indeed. However, we would be missing something rather significant, what the old radio personality Paul Henry would call the rest of the story. We forget something important when we read the inspiring words, "To bigotry, no sanction; to persecution, no assistance," written by one G. Washington. We forget that that great leader, on this very journey through the states, had in his retinue enslaved people. We forget that the new Constitution he was selling, without one mention of the word slave, wove bigotry and persecution inherent in the legal ownership of human beings into the fabric of the nation. We forget that Washington took full advantage not only of slavery, but of the legalistic clause on this slide, which later formed the constitutional basis for the infamous Fugitive Slave Act, with the case of Ona Judge being just one example of that in the life of Washington. We forget that even after the Civil War, once Reconstruction was crushed by the South, which rose again, those of darker skin did not, to once again quote Washington's letter, possess alike liberty of conscience and immunities of citizenship. In the very Galveston to which the Jews were welcomed by the mayor, Jim Crow ruled the roost all the way up to the beach. In fact, African Americans were restricted to one small block along the water between the 28th and 29th Streets. This state of Texas, like the rest of the South, was no kingdom of kindness to its African American citizens. And even in the North, though preferable to the South, segregation remained alive and well in way too many places. And let us not forget that redlining was the official policy of the federal government in most communities throughout the country until 1968. Therefore, Rabbi Moshe Feinstein's words that the U.S. government's only goal is to do good on behalf of the residents of the country would have rung hollow to any person of color. And yet, I would like to think that the words of Washington in 1790 and the words of that newly minted Galvestonian in the early 1900s, like the Declaration of Independence, represented a promise for the future. This may have been a future that they did not or could not think of, a future where their words pertains not only to the Jewish citizens of the United States, but to its African American citizens too. This is the future that Martin Luther King called for and demanded with his bad check metaphor. So how are we doing on that check? Have we made good on it yet? Not quite. We as a society often say to our African American brothers and sisters words that sound like Jeremiah's, and seek the peace of the city whither I have caused you to be carried away captive, and pray unto the Lord for it, for in the peace thereof shall ye have peace. And yet, we speak a lie. Despite the monumental progress this country has made since the days of Washington, can any of us, with a straight face, say to African Americans, for in the peace thereof shall ye have peace? How can we, when innocent African Americans like Tamir Rice, Philando Castile, and Dallas's own Botham Jean are struck down by those sworn to keep the peace? The bad check is still returning, and the words of King marked insufficient funds. And it's time we make good on that promissory note. It's time to act. Enough with the words and the promises. Now, I'm an existentialist, so I believe that each of us must answer that call to action in their own way. What follows is my answer, and the answers of others here in Dallas, who I've been blessed to work with. In 2016, the then Center for Social Innovation, or C4, brought the facts in the black type to our attention. I did some research and discovered the facts in red. These Dallas numbers were shocking. In Dallas, African Americans make up 13% of the county population, yet they make up 67% of the homeless population and 70% of the unsheltered homeless population. The folks at C4 told me I must be wrong. They didn't believe those numbers. I was not wrong. These are the correct numbers. Now, C4 was having this discussion with a number of communities at that time. And in Dallas, this discussion occurred in a very particular context. In the aftermath of the July 7th, 2016 shooting, which left 5 police officers dead and more injured, United Way of Metropolitan Dallas had called for programs that could heal the city, specifically in the area of race. Fortuitously, at that same time, the aforementioned C4 called for cities to join a research and action program, later named SPARC, for supporting partnerships for anti-racist communities to, and I quote, close the racial gap that has led to disproportionate homelessness among African Americans. And so, United Way of Metropolitan Dallas's Unite Dallas Relief Fund gave us $32,700 to cover the cost of the entire program. And the Metro Dallas Homeless Alliance partnered with C4 and other cities towards establishing racial equity in homeless services. In late 2016, C4 kicked things off with an installment of our ongoing series, Hard Conversations, at the Dallas Public Library, titled Racism and Homelessness, and delivered training on the subject to our homeless response system professionals. Beginning then and through 2017, they met regularly with us and key community players, including foundations, organizations, pastors, and other advocates. And they conducted in-depth quantitative and qualitative research, including analyzing 5 years of records from our homeless response system's community-wide database, the Homeless Management Information System, or HMIS. In February of 2018, C4 held a national conference in February, which we were invited to and participated in. And in March, they issued a national as well as community-specific data-rich reports on their research with very specific recommendations. And that same month, we held a system-wide homeless response system leadership retreat here in Dallas, which, among other things, endorsed all of the SPARC recommendations. Shortly after that, MDHA experienced a leadership change, and C4 and SPARC did too. And it was up to me and our new interim leader, Diana Romanoli, who today serves as our VP of Operations, to keep the SPARC ember burning here in Dallas. And during this interregnum period, the MDHA board endorsed the strategic plan produced at the March retreat, including all of the SPARC recommendations. And Faith Forward Dallas helped us continue this work too. Faith Forward Dallas is a group of progressive clergy from different religions who work together on important civic issues in Dallas. They had invited me to join them since they wanted to get more involved in homelessness. And we took a prominent Faith Forward Dallas member, Reverend Dr. Michael Waters, with us to the February SPARC conference. We eventually signed a shared homelessness initiative with them with an emphasis on racial equity. Entered Jerry Hawkins. Now, this might sound like hyperbole, but this Chicagoland native has become the authority on Dallas's racial history and how it influences our past, our present, and our future. And you really owe it to yourself to learn all you can about his work and the work of TRHT. Now, around the time Jerry and I first sat down to discuss our next steps in Dallas, our community had scored dead last out of 274 cities in overall economic and racial inclusion, according to the Urban Institute. You do not score 274 out of 274 by accident. That actually takes effort. Now, one of the reasons I had reached out to Jerry was that we at MDHA were feeling a little lost about what to do next. We needed Jerry's expert opinion and his help. Also, I found myself in a very weird situation with United Way of Metropolitan Dallas. You see, normally, development directors ask funding entities for money. In mid-2018, however, it was United Way of Metropolitan Dallas that was asking us if we could use more funding for our racial equity work. They had really liked what we had done with SPARC so far and wanted to help us build on that work. I asked them to give us 2 or 3 months to produce a plan first. In late 2018, Jerry created a racial equity plan of action, and he called it Racial Equity and Homelessness 2.0, and United Way of Metropolitan Dallas funded it with another $30,000 from the Unite Dallas Relief Fund. In mid-2019, TRHT issued a groundbreaking report, a new community vision for Dallas, which highlighted that plan of action, and you really owe it to yourself to study the entire report carefully. MDHA and TRHT formed a racial equity task force to guide our work under this new plan. It includes representatives from United Way of Metropolitan Dallas, Faith Forward Dallas, and The Bridge, and it is chaired by Nissi New of the Child Poverty Action Lab. And Nissi has kept this train on the tracks and kept us accountable to advancing our work. TRHT built and began a pilot to train everyone at The Bridge, our community's publicly funded homeless recovery center, top to bottom, from the board to peer navigators, including every partner that works on their campus. Dr. David Woody, the Bridge president and CEO, who is passionate about this work, has testified to the fact that even though they only started these trainings, they are already seeing results on the ground at The Bridge. Concurrently, we began planning how to roll out similar trainings at other homeless response system partners. And then the pandemic hit and threw a monkey wrench into, well, everything. We didn't press stop, though. We just hit pause. We have continued to virtually meet, allowed ourselves to breathe and contemplate how we continue to do our work. And like many others, we have been reflecting not only on the extreme but unsurprising manifestations of racial inequities inherent in the pandemic, but how they juxtapose with those inequities that are inherent in homelessness. And that is where we are at the moment. You can follow our journey as it unfolded in real time, so to speak, by visiting our old blog, our new blog, and the rest of our website. Just click through on each of these links on this slide and the next one in order. The National Alliance to End Homelessness Conference in Washington, D.C. is the largest annual gathering of professionals who work in the arena of homelessness. Since I've only been in this field since 2014, my first conference was in 2017. This was also the first conference where racial equity became a focus. Before that, C4 would usually be given a small room for a session or two. That year, the C4 folks, Jeff Olivet and Mark Dones, were given a much larger role and a much larger room, and even spoke shortly after HUD Secretary Carson at one of the plenary lunches. At the end of that conference, I visited the Lincoln Memorial for the first time in many years, and these words of the second inaugural address stood out to me. With malice toward none, with charity for all, with a firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in. Lincoln, who is pictured here delivering that very address, may not have been familiar with the terms systems thinking or systems change, but he was presiding over perhaps the greatest systems change in our country's history. He devoted most of this very short address to the subject. And short as that address was, in a sense, the work that needed to be done to bring equity and equality to every person in our land has been long and hard, and it is not over yet. And so we must continue Lincoln's work and continue to change the system. Only then will the vision of Washington, the vision of the prophets come true, not just for my people, but for all people. Then we will be able to say that each of our African American brothers and sisters shall sit under his own vine and fig tree, and there shall be none to make him afraid.